The rain was relentless, pelting against the window with fury. Inside the sterile walls of the hospital, there was only silence. The kind of silence that envelopes a room when everything feels hopeless. Dr. Olivia Hartwell sat at her desk, her fingers idly tracing the edge of a medical chart. Another long shift. Another heart-wrenching loss. She had given it all, every ounce of energy, every ounce of focus. But some things, no matter how skilled you are, just cannot be fixed. She had seen too much. Trauma victims, patients in their last moments, families crushed by grief. It had all started to blur together. Olivia had built walls to survive. She couldn't allow herself to feel every single loss. The pain would drown her. But there was something that always seemed to break through. Her phone buzzed on the desk, cutting through the stillness. A text. "Come home, Liv. I'm waiting." Jake, the one person who was supposed to be her support, but lately, even his words seemed distant. He hadn't come home from his shift as a paramedic for days. Every text from him was a reminder of how fractured their relationship had become. Still, she sighed, debating whether to go home or stay at the hospital. She leaned back in her chair, glancing at the clock. The long, tiring hours were beginning to take their toll. Just then, a nurse knocked softly before entering. "Dr. Hartwell, you might want to see this," the nurse said, her voice hesitant. Olivia frowned, not sure if she was prepared for yet another case. "What is it?" "There's a dog in the ICU. It's been with a patient who's not expected to make it through the night." Olivia raised an eyebrow. A dog? In the ICU? It wasn't entirely uncommon, but it was rare for a patient's pet to stay at the hospital without clear permission. The rules were strict. "What's the story?" Olivia asked, getting up and grabbing her coat. "The dog's been with Mr. Lawson for hours. He's been sitting beside the bed, not leaving, even as the machines beeped and his heart rate dropped. He's not eating, just watching." Olivia's curiosity piqued, despite herself. "I'll take a look." She followed the nurse down the hospital corridor, the cold, clinical air of the ICU seeping into her bones. As she approached the room, she saw it, the dog, a large, dark-coated German shepherd, lying still beside the bed. His eyes, weary and hollow, stared out from beneath fur matted with dirt, as if he had been on a journey far longer than anyone could understand. He didn't seem afraid of her approach, nor did he show the typical nervousness a dog might display in the presence of strangers. Instead, he simply watched her, waiting. His gaze was intense, sad, but filled with an undeniable sense of loyalty. The room smelled sterile, the hum of machines, the steady beep of the heart monitor, filling the silence. Olivia approached the bed where Mr. Lawson lay. His family had left earlier in the day, understanding that there was nothing more to be done. The dog, however, had stayed. The emotional bond between them was evident. It struck her. This dog was waiting for something. Not just for his owner's survival, but for a promise, a connection she couldn't yet place. She crouched down to the dog's level, extending her hand slowly, gently. The dog didn't flinch or shy away. He leaned into her touch, as if he knew she was part of his world now, too. She whispered softly, "You've been through so much, haven't you?" There was a moment, a strange, deep connection, that shifted something inside Olivia's heart. For a brief moment, she wasn't a doctor or a professional. She was just a human, standing in the presence of something so pure, so raw. She felt an overwhelming sense of empathy. And then, before she could react, the dog's ears perked up. He stood up, his body suddenly rigid with attention. He turned toward the bed, staring at Mr. Lawson, his eyes pleading. Olivia followed the dog's gaze. She saw the faintest rise and fall of Mr. Lawson's chest, then nothing. The machines flatlined. The dog howled once, a mournful sound that resonated through Olivia's very soul. In that moment, everything stopped. Time stood still. This was not just an animal in pain. This was a soul who had shared in the deepest human experience, loss. And yet, despite it all, the dog had stayed, keeping vigil until the end. The ICU became quieter than before. Olivia stood there, trying to process what she was witnessing. But she couldn't. How did a dog form such a deep attachment? What did it mean to care that much, to wait that long, for someone who could never return? As her heart raced, she realized she couldn't leave yet. Not now. Not after this. She remained by the dog's side, unsure of the next step, but knowing deep down that something in her life had shifted. This dog had found his doctor's heart, and that heart had begun to heal, without her even realizing it. Dr. Olivia Hartwell had always believed in the sanctity of science, the cold, undeniable facts that led to precise actions. Her life had been built on this foundation. As a trauma surgeon, every decision she made was grounded in training, practice, and experience. Emotions had no place in the operating room. They clouded judgment, distracted from the task at hand. And for Olivia, distraction was a luxury she could not afford. She had entered the field of medicine with a singular purpose: to save lives. It was a noble pursuit, a way to make a difference. The first few years had been filled with the thrill of success, of watching patients wake up from the brink of death, of feeling the surge of accomplishment when a difficult surgery went well. But that was before the relentless nature of the profession began to chip away at her spirit. Years in the field had taught her that medicine was about more than just saving lives. It was about managing pain. The weight of every loss, every death, settled on her shoulders like a 1,000-pound stone, heavy and unrelenting. With each passing year, the victories began to feel less like triumphs and more like fleeting moments in a never-ending struggle. She had become numb to it all, compartmentalizing her emotions in order to survive. Her personal life mirrored the walls she had built around herself professionally. Her marriage to Jake, once full of promise and hope, had begun to deteriorate. They had been together for years, but the demands of their careers had driven a wedge between them that no amount of love seemed to heal. Jake, a paramedic who had once been her rock, had retreated into himself, as though the trauma of his own work had left him incapable of connecting on any deeper level. The affection between them had withered, replaced by tired routines and empty conversations. Olivia had stopped trying to repair the cracks in their relationship. She had stopped believing it was worth saving. There were moments when she thought about leaving, about walking away from it all. But the fear of what that might mean, of being alone in a world that demanded so much, kept her tethered to the life she knew. Olivia had become so immersed in her work that she had lost sight of who she was outside of it. She was a doctor. That was all. There was nothing else to her anymore. No passion outside of the operating room. No connection outside of her patients. The long hours of her shifts began to blur together. Days merged into nights, and nights into days, without any sense of time. The relentless cycle of trauma, the never-ending emergencies, became her reality. She lived in the hospital, and the hospital lived within her. It was a relationship born of necessity. One evening, after a particularly grueling surgery, Olivia sat in her office, the faint light of the street lamps outside casting shadows across the room. The sterile silence of the hospital pressed in on her, a constant reminder of the weight of her work. Her phone buzzed on the desk, pulling her from her thoughts. She glanced at it absently. Jake. It had been days since they'd last spoken. His messages had become more sporadic, more distant, and she had stopped reading them altogether. But tonight, for some reason, she opened the message. "Come home, Liv. I'm waiting." A pang of guilt twisted inside her chest. The words seemed so simple, yet they carried a heavy weight. She had always prided herself on being strong, on being independent, but there was a vulnerability in Jake's message that she couldn't ignore. It felt like a lifeline, a desperate plea for her attention. She hesitated, unsure of how to respond. She had been avoiding him for weeks, but the loneliness that echoed in her heart made her reconsider. Before she could reply, the door to her office creaked open. Nurse Angela stepped in, her expression serious. "Dr. Hartwell, you might want to take a look at something," Angela said, her voice tinged with urgency. Olivia frowned, her mind still half focused on Jake's message. "What's going on?" "There's a dog in the ICU. He's been with Mr. Lawson for hours, and we can't get him to leave." Olivia blinked in confusion. "A dog? In the ICU?" The nurse nodded. "Yes, he's been sitting by the bed the whole time. It's like he's waiting for something, or someone, and he won't leave." It was an odd request, but something about Angela's tone made Olivia stand up and pull on her coat without hesitation. "Lead the way." As they walked down the cold, sterile halls of the hospital, the faint sounds of beeping machines and hushed conversations filled the air. The ICU was always a somber place, reserved for those in critical condition, those who were teetering on the edge between life and death. It was a place where every breath, every heartbeat, was a fragile gift. When they reached the ICU, Olivia was surprised to see a large German shepherd lying motionless at the foot of Mr. Lawson's bed. The dog's fur was dirty, matted, and worn, as though he had been through a battle of his own. His eyes, though weary, held a sense of quiet dignity, as though he were waiting for something far more important than any of them could understand. Olivia's gaze shifted to Mr. Lawson, who lay still on the bed, hooked up to machines. He was unconscious, his vitals steadily declining. His family had already left, accepting the inevitability of his condition. But this dog, Max, had not left his side. It was almost as if he had made a silent promise to stay, no matter what. Olivia walked over, her steps tentative. She crouched down to the dog's level, unsure of how to approach him. But to her surprise, Max didn't back away. Instead, he sat up slowly, his gaze lifting to meet hers. There was something in his eyes, something so raw, so vulnerable, that it took Olivia's breath away. "Hey there," she whispered, her voice soft. "It's okay. I'm not here to hurt you." Max's gaze held hers for a long moment, and in that silence, something passed between them. It was as though he was asking her for help, or perhaps something even deeper, an understanding that Olivia couldn't quite explain. It was the look of a dog who had witnessed too much, who had borne the weight of an unspoken grief that neither of them could carry alone. As Olivia sat beside the bed, her fingers gently brushed the dog's fur. Max did not flinch. Instead, he leaned into her touch, as though he had been waiting for someone to acknowledge him, to see him not as a stray animal, but as a soul carrying a story of his own. The warmth of his body was a stark contrast to the coldness of the sterile hospital environment. Olivia looked down at the dog, noticing how his ribs protruded slightly under his fur, evidence of hunger, of survival. His fur, though once thick and glossy, had become matted and dirty from the streets he had walked, a far cry from the healthy, well-cared-for animal she had seen in the past. His eyes, however, were what caught her attention the most. They were deep, filled with something that made Olivia feel both vulnerable and understood. She knew the stories of street animals, of those who had suffered in silence. She had seen countless patients whose lives had been changed by neglect, abuse, and abandonment. But there was something about this dog, Max, that reached her on a deeper level. It was as if he, too, had suffered in silence for far too long, and now, in this hospital room, there was a chance for healing. For a brief moment, Olivia's mind wandered back to her own life. She thought about the distance between herself and Jake, how their relationship had slowly crumbled under the weight of unspoken words and unmet needs. She thought about her growing isolation, her inability to connect with anyone beyond the operating room. It had all become too much. But here, with Max, there was no need for words. There was no pressure to explain herself, to justify her feelings. In the dog's quiet presence, she found solace. It was in this moment that Olivia realized something profound. She wasn't just taking care of the dog. He was healing her in ways she hadn't even understood she needed. His silent companionship was filling a void in her heart that had been left empty for far too long. Max's quiet whine pulled her back into the present. She looked up to see the nurse, Angela, standing by the door, her expression uncertain. "I've never seen him like this before," Angela said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He's never stayed with any of the patients this long. Not like this." Olivia nodded, her fingers still gently scratching behind Max's ear. "He's different," she murmured, more to herself than to Angela. The nurse hesitated before stepping closer, glancing at Mr. Lawson. His condition hadn't improved, and the monitors continued to beep steadily. Do you think he knows?" Olivia shook her head slightly. "I don't know. But there's something here, Angela. Something between them." It was hard to describe, but Olivia could feel the bond that had formed between the dog and the patient. It wasn't just the companionship that Max offered. It was the quiet sense of loyalty that filled the room. Max had not left Mr. Lawson's side, even though the man was no longer conscious, no longer able to acknowledge the dog's presence. Max wasn't there because he was being fed or cared for. He was there because he had chosen to be. In a world where many abandoned their loved ones at the first sign of difficulty, Max was the one showing up. Olivia had seen people leave their families, their friends, when the going got tough. But this dog was an embodiment of loyalty, of love in its purest form. It was a love that didn't ask for anything in return, a love that didn't count the hours or keep track of the sacrifices made. Max had come from the streets, had endured hardship, and yet he had remained steadfast. For who? For Mr. Lawson? For the man who lay unconscious, whose fate had already been sealed? Or had he come for something else? Olivia leaned back against the cold wall, her mind racing. What was it that drew Max to this place, to this hospital, to this man who would never be able to thank him? The thought lingered with her as she stayed by his side, holding the dog's head in her lap, the connection between them deepening by the minute. She had always believed in the importance of being present for her patients, but this was different. This was more than a medical professional's duty. This was something she couldn't explain, something she had never experienced before. For the first time in what felt like forever, Olivia allowed herself to close her eyes, just for a moment. She could feel Max's heartbeat beneath her hand, the slow, rhythmic pulse that reminded her of the fragility of life. She could feel her own heartbeat, too, slower, steadier, as if it were in sync with his. It was a simple connection, but it was everything. It was the kind of connection that she had long forgotten existed, the kind of bond that had nothing to do with status, nothing to do with being perfect or successful. It was raw, unfiltered, and full of the one thing that mattered most, presence. Max gave her something no patient or colleague had ever given her. He gave her the chance to heal without conditions, to exist without fear of being judged or abandoned. Hours passed, and the night deepened. The hospital grew quieter as the shift changed, and the staff began to file in and out. But Olivia stayed. She sat there, by Mr. Lawson's side, watching the dog, who had found a way to give her heart back. She had no words to express the depth of the gratitude she felt for this strange and quiet companion. She didn't need words. The silence between them said everything. It wasn't long before she realized the significance of the moment. This dog, who had come from a place of pain and abandonment, had found a way to bring peace into a life filled with chaos and uncertainty. And in doing so, Max had become more than just a stray animal. He had become her teacher, her healer, her companion. He had given her a glimpse of what it meant to truly live again, to embrace vulnerability, and to trust that even in the darkest moments, there could be light. In that quiet ICU room, surrounded by the hum of machines and the scent of antiseptic, Olivia knew one thing for sure. Max had saved her in ways she could never have expected. The days following Max's initial recovery were both hopeful and uncertain. Olivia found herself increasingly consumed with his care, watching the slow but steady improvement in his health. He was eating more, his coat was beginning to regain its sheen, and his once dull eyes had sparked with life again. But for every moment of progress, there were still flashes of struggle. The pain of his past still lingered in his weary bones, and there were nights when he would whimper softly in his sleep, trapped in some memory of the cold streets from which he had come. Olivia couldn't help but see herself in those moments. The quiet moments of suffering, the vulnerability, the fear of never fully healing. Max, too, carried with him the invisible scars of abandonment, a loss so profound that it haunted his every movement. She knew that healing wasn't just about the physical, the malnutrition, the physical trauma. It was about what lingered beneath the surface. She would sit by his side for hours, silently observing him, speaking to him softly, as if she could somehow reassure him, tell him that he was safe now, that he would never have to face the cold again. But the truth was, she wasn't just speaking to him. She was speaking to herself. She was speaking to the broken parts of herself that had been shut away for so long, buried beneath the weight of her job, the relentless pressure to be perfect, to hold it all together. Max's recovery, slow as it was, gave her a sense of purpose she hadn't realized she was missing. There were no shortcuts, no easy answers. She knew that healing would take time, both for him and for herself. But something in her heart told her that if she could help Max survive, she could finally face the broken pieces of her own life. She had been running for so long, avoiding her own emotional scars. But in caring for Max, she had to confront her own fears, her own pain. It wasn't just the exhaustion of her work anymore. It wasn't just the emotional distance that had grown between her and Jake. It was more than that. Max had become a mirror, reflecting the cracks she had ignored for years, the parts of herself that she had kept hidden. And the more she tried to fix him, the more she realized she needed to fix herself too. But the world didn't stop for self-reflection. Every day, the hospital was filled with emergencies, patients in need of life-saving surgeries, and families desperate for any ounce of hope. Olivia knew she couldn't let her personal struggles get in the way. She was a doctor, after all. She had sworn an oath to save lives. Yet, every time she looked at Max, she felt a pull to stay, to protect him. It wasn't just about his survival anymore. It was about a deeper bond that had formed between them, a bond that neither of them had ever anticipated. It was unspoken, raw, and fragile, but it was real. The challenge of saving Max was not just medical, it was emotional. And as the days wore on, Olivia could feel the weight of it all, the emotional toll of both his recovery and the mounting stress at work. She was running on empty, pushing herself harder and harder each day. But the demands of the hospital, the constant pressure of saving lives, were beginning to catch up to her. One late afternoon, as Olivia was finishing up her rounds, a new wave of patients flooded into the emergency room. The storm outside had turned treacherous, and several car accidents had resulted in multiple casualties. Olivia immediately shifted into autopilot, her focus narrowing to the urgent cases in front of her. The adrenaline rush was both familiar and overwhelming. But as she worked, her mind kept drifting back to Max. Was he okay? Was he resting? She knew he was still weak, still fragile. He couldn't be left alone for long periods of time. But the hospital's needs were immediate, and the patients' lives were hanging in the balance. It was a familiar struggle. Her heart pulled in one direction, her duty to her patients pulling her in the other. In the chaos of the ER, Olivia found herself questioning everything. Could she really save everyone? Could she balance this growing emotional connection with Max and her professional responsibilities? The exhaustion was starting to show in her face, in her eyes. Her movements had become slower, more deliberate. She hadn't slept in over 48 hours. Yet, somehow, she had to keep going. At one point, as she made her way back to the ICU to check on Max, a nurse approached her, her face drawn with worry. "Dr. Olivia, Max, he's not doing well. His condition's deteriorating faster than we expected." Olivia's heart sank. The words hit her like a blow to the chest. She didn't even wait for the nurse to finish before she rushed toward the ICU. The fear that had been building inside her, fear of losing him, fear of failing, had suddenly become a living, breathing monster, gnawing at her every step. Olivia rushed to the ICU, her heartbeat pounding in her chest, drowning out the noise around her. She pushed past the staff and straight into the small room where Max lay. The sight of him, his body frail and his breathing shallow, struck her like a punch to the gut. His fur, which had once looked so rough and worn, now appeared limp and lifeless. The slow rise and fall of his chest was a reminder of the fragility of life, a reminder that time was running out. She knelt beside him, her hand trembling as it brushed his fur. She had always prided herself on being composed in moments of crisis, but now, seeing Max in this state, she felt helpless. The years of training, the countless surgeries she had performed, seemed irrelevant in this moment. All she could do was watch as the dog who had given her solace during her darkest days struggled to stay alive. "Please, Max," Olivia whispered, her voice breaking. "I need you to fight. I can't lose you." The nurse who had informed her of Max's condition stood quietly at the doorway, watching as Olivia knelt by his side. The room was heavy with the unspoken weight of the situation. "The antibiotics aren't working as we hoped," the nurse finally spoke, her voice soft. "He's showing signs of infection. His body is weak. We might have to make some hard decisions soon." The words hit Olivia like a wave, pulling her deeper into the ocean of uncertainty. She felt a pang in her chest, The same one she had felt when she lost her first patient many years ago, a child who had died under her care. The guilt, the helplessness, the feeling of failure, it all came rushing back. Could she save Max? Or would he slip through her fingers, just like so many others had? Please, Olivia pleaded, her voice desperate. What else can we do? The nurse hesitated, glancing at the medical chart. We're doing everything we can. But if there's no improvement by tomorrow... Olivia didn't let her finish. She couldn't. The thought of losing him was unbearable. Max had come into her life at a time when she needed him most, offering unconditional companionship, warmth, and loyalty when she felt like she had nothing left to give. Now he was fighting for his life, and Olivia would fight with him, no matter what it took. But the weight of the decision was like an anchor pulling her under. The hospital was not the right place for Max anymore. His immune system was already compromised, and with the constant influx of sick patients, there was a risk of him being exposed to more serious illnesses. The cold, sterile environment of the ICU was doing more harm than good. Max needed warmth. He needed love. He needed a home. Olivia made a decision then, one that she knew would change everything. She would take Max home. She would give him a fighting chance in the place that had healed her, the place where she could truly give him the care he needed, away from the chaos of the hospital. It was a gamble, but it was the only choice she had left. The nurse looked at her with concern. Are you sure, Dr. Olivia? He's not out of the woods yet. We could keep him here. Olivia stood up, her decision made. I'm sure, she said, her voice firm. I'm taking him home. I know what he needs. With the nurse's help, Olivia arranged for Max to be discharged. It wasn't easy, and there were many hurdles to overcome, but Olivia refused to give up. She had watched Max suffer on the streets, fighting for his life, never giving up, even when the odds were stacked against him. She wasn't going to let him down now. By the time the evening arrived, the storm had grown worse. Snow had begun to fall in thick sheets, blanketing the city in an endless sea of white. Olivia drove slowly, her hands gripping the steering wheel, her mind racing with worry. Max lay on the passenger seat, his body wrapped in blankets, his head resting on her lap. She could feel his warmth, his steady heartbeat, and she prayed it was enough to sustain him through the night. The drive home felt endless, each minute stretching longer than the last. Olivia's heart was heavy with fear, but also with a flicker of hope. This was it. This was the last chance they had. She would give Max everything she had. When they finally arrived, Olivia carefully lifted Max out of the car, cradling him against her chest. She could feel his frail body shaking, his breath shallow. She rushed inside, turning on the lights and setting up a space for him by the fireplace. The warmth of the fire contrasted with the icy cold outside, and Olivia hoped it would be enough to pull Max through. For hours, she stayed by his side, watching him carefully, making sure he was warm and comfortable. The house was quiet, save for the crackling of the fire and Max's occasional whimper. She whispered soothing words to him, letting him know he was safe now, that he didn't have to be afraid anymore. As the night wore on, Olivia began to feel the weight of the last few days catch up with her. She was exhausted, physically, emotionally, and mentally. But she couldn't leave Max. Not when he needed her most. She would stay with him, through the night, through the storm, and through whatever came next. Morning arrived, but Olivia had barely noticed. The night had been a blur of endless minutes, each one stretching into the next, each second a new test of her resolve. The fire in the hearth had burned low, but the warmth it provided was a poor substitute for the heat she longed for within herself. She had barely slept, instead remaining at Max's side, watching him, praying that he would make it through the night. The storm outside was relentless, the snow continuing to fall in thick, heavy sheets. It seemed to mirror Olivia's internal turmoil, the weight of everything she had been carrying, the immense responsibility of caring for a life so fragile. She stared out the window for a moment, her mind still racing with questions, uncertainties, and the fear of what might happen next. But when her eyes drifted back to Max, everything else seemed to fade away. His form, once limp and lifeless, now seemed to be breathing just a little more easily. The shallow, labored breaths from the night, before had deepened into steadier rhythms. Max's chest rose and fell with an almost imperceptible shift, the tension in his body easing, his limbs no longer as rigid with pain. It was a small thing, almost unnoticeable, but for Olivia, it was a sign, a glimmer of hope in the darkness. She couldn't help herself. She leaned forward, her hand reaching for his fur, brushing it softly. It was almost as if she were afraid to touch him too roughly, fearing that any abrupt movement might disrupt the fragile balance he had found between life and death. His eyes flickered open. For a moment, Olivia froze, her breath catching in her throat. Max's gaze was weak, but there was a spark in his eyes, a flicker of recognition. It was brief, almost like a whisper of life returning, but it was enough. "Max," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Hey, buddy. You're awake." Max's eyes blinked a few times, slowly adjusting to the light. He looked confused, disoriented, but there was no fear in his eyes. There was no panic. Instead, there was something softer, something that mirrored Olivia's own exhaustion, her own vulnerability. She wasn't just a doctor to him anymore. She was something else, maybe a lifeline, a person who had offered him the one thing that had been missing from his life: care, warmth, and love. She ran her fingers through his fur, careful not to disturb him too much. The gentleness of the touch seemed to comfort him, and he let out a small sigh, shifting his body ever so slightly. He nuzzled into the blankets, his head resting against the soft fabric of the couch. Olivia stayed there for a moment, just watching him. For the first time in days, the tension in her chest eased. Max was still weak, but this was progress. It was small, but it was progress. She stood slowly, her body aching from the long hours of vigil. Her legs felt heavy, stiff, but there was a lightness in her chest she hadn't realized she was missing. She stepped over to the kitchen and prepared some food for him, soft, easy-to-digest meals that would help him regain his strength. She took care to make everything just right, thinking back to the days when she had worked tirelessly as a pediatric surgeon, ensuring every patient received exactly what they needed. As she returned to Max's side with the food, she found him still resting, his breathing slower now, more stable. The fire in the hearth crackled, casting shadows across the room as if to mark the passing of time. Olivia had no idea how much time had passed. It felt like days, weeks, but when she checked the clock, only a few hours had gone by since she had made the decision to bring him home. Sitting down beside him once more, she held the bowl close to his face. "Max, you need to eat," she coaxed gently. Max's ears perked up at the scent of food, and he raised his head slowly, his eyes still cloudy, but showing a glimmer of curiosity. Olivia held the bowl just within reach, making sure he could see it clearly. His nose twitched as he sniffed the air, his head shifting slightly in her direction. His gaze, still tired, focused on the food, then returned to her face. There was no mistaking it. He was trying. She offered him the food carefully, lifting the bowl a little higher. Slowly, but surely, Max stretched out his neck and sniffed the meal. His first tentative lick of the food was shaky, uncertain, but it was enough to reassure Olivia that he had the strength to try. She watched, her heart swelling with pride, as he took another hesitant bite. The moment felt monumental. It wasn't just about the food. It was about his will to survive, his decision to keep fighting. This wasn't just a dog eating to survive. This was a dog who was finding his strength again, piece by piece, bite by bite. And Olivia was right there with him, watching it all unfold. She stayed with him as he finished his small meal, occasionally offering gentle praise. "That's it, Max. You're doing great." As he lay back down, his body relaxing against the cushions, Olivia leaned back too, exhaustion beginning to creep up on her. She allowed herself a moment of rest, her own fatigue catching up with her now that she felt a small weight lifted from her shoulders. Max's breathing was steady, a comfort she hadn't expected. It wasn't the loud, panicked breaths he had taken the night before. It wasn't the breath of a dog on the verge of collapse. No, this was different. This was the breath of a dog who had made it through the worst of the storm. In that quiet room, with only the soft crackling of the fire for company, Olivia allowed herself to close her eyes, just for a moment. She couldn't afford to fall asleep, not yet, but she felt a tiny flicker of peace inside her. A flicker of hope. Max had made it through the night. And for that, Olivia was grateful. Olivia sat beside Max, her eyes fixed on the dog as he slept soundly, his body curled up in a nest of blankets. The storm outside had eased, but the world felt as cold as ever. The snow had blanketed everything, leaving the house in an eerie silence. The fire in the hearth had long since burned down to embers, and the chill from the outside seeped in through the walls. But inside, Olivia was determined to keep the warmth alive, not just in the house, but in Max's fragile body as well. He had made it through the night. He had eaten. He had survived. But Olivia knew the real battle was only beginning. Max's recovery was delicate. It wasn't just a matter of feeding him and giving him warmth. He had been through so much in his short life already. His body was weak, his immune system compromised. The infection that had ravaged his body was still present, lurking beneath the surface, ready to strike again. Max was a fighter, but Olivia wasn't sure if his strength would be enough to pull him through. Every moment felt like a delicate balancing act. Olivia spent hours each day caring for Max, doing everything she could to give him the best chance at survival. She fed him small meals, carefully prepared to give him the nutrients he needed to regain his strength. She kept him warm, wrapped in blankets, surrounded by the soft glow of the fireplace. And she watched him, never leaving his side for too long, constantly searching for any sign that he was improving. But even as she cared for him, the weight of the situation continued to press down on her. Every small setback was a reminder that Max wasn't out of danger yet. The infection could flare up again at any moment. His fragile body could give into the strain, and she would lose him. The thought of losing him was unbearable. Olivia had been through so much in her career, seen so many patients come and go. She had been the one to deliver bad news to families, to tell them that their loved ones were beyond saving. But this was different. This wasn't just a patient. This wasn't just a case to be handled with medical detachment. This was Max, the dog who had shown her love when she needed it most. The dog who had given her hope when she had lost it. She couldn't lose him. Her mind raced as she sat beside him, her hand resting on his warm fur. It felt so fragile, so fleeting, this bond between them. But it was real. She could feel it in her bones, in the way Max would nudge her hand when she stopped petting him, in the way he would look at her with those big brown eyes, as if trying to tell her something. She had to fight for him. She had to make sure he survived. The doorbell rang, pulling Olivia from her thoughts. She stood quickly, her heart skipping a beat. It was a familiar sound, one that was welcome, but it reminded her of the outside world, of everything she had left behind in the chaos of the hospital and the storm. The world outside had been cruel to Max, and it was hard to know if she could ever trust it again. She opened the door to find a familiar face, Dr. Harris, her colleague and friend from the veterinary hospital. He had heard about Max's condition and had come to check on him. "Olivia," Dr. Harris said, his expression a mixture of concern and relief. "I heard about Max. How's he doing?" "He's hanging on," Olivia replied, her voice thick with emotion. "But I'm not sure how much longer he can keep fighting. The infection is still there, and I'm doing everything I can, but I don't know if it's enough." Dr. Harris nodded gravely. "You're doing everything right. But the truth is, Max's body has been through a lot. He's in critical condition, and while it's good that he's still eating and seems stable, there's a chance he'll deteriorate again. We need to keep monitoring him closely." "I know," Olivia said softly, her eyes casting down to the floor. She didn't want to admit it, but she knew the truth. Max wasn't out of the woods yet, and the longer he stayed here, away from the hospital, the more dangerous it became. Dr. Harris seemed to read her thoughts. "If you want, we can bring him back to the clinic. We have the resources to monitor him more closely. He might have a better chance there." Olivia felt a pang of guilt. She didn't want to bring Max back to the cold, sterile hospital. He had already been through so much, and the thought of putting him through more procedures, more tests, made her stomach churn. But she also knew that Dr. Harris was right. Max needed care that she couldn't provide on her own, and if she wanted him to survive, she had to be willing to make hard decisions. The two of them stood in the doorway, both of them uncertain of what to do next. Olivia could see the concern in Dr. Harris's eyes, but she could also see his resolve. He was trying to help her, trying to do what was best for Max. And deep down, she knew he was right. Max's survival depended on this. But the thought of taking Max back to the hospital felt like a betrayal. Olivia had promised him that he would be safe here, in her care. She had promised him warmth, love, and comfort, things that the cold, sterile hospital could never offer. She looked down at Max, still resting peacefully on the couch, his body curled up in the blankets. For a moment, the weight of the decision seemed too much to bear. She had fought for him already, brought him out of the darkness. Was she really ready to risk losing him again? Dr. Harris's voice broke through her thoughts. Olivia, I know this is hard, but you don't have to do this alone. We can get Max the help he needs. He's not out of options yet. We can still save him. Olivia's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't let them fall. She couldn't. Not yet. I'll bring him back to the clinic, she said, her voice steady. He deserves every chance to survive. Dr. Harris nodded, his expression softening. We'll do everything we can. With a deep breath, Olivia turned to Max, her heart heavy with the weight of what was to come. She knew the battle wasn't over. The fight for Max's survival was just beginning. But she wouldn't stop fighting. Not now. Not ever. As Olivia loaded Max into the car, the weight of the decision settled heavily on her shoulders. She could feel the cool, sterile air of the hospital creeping into her thoughts, even as the warmth of her home seemed to fade with each passing mile. It felt wrong, unnatural, to be driving him away from the sanctuary she had created for him in the living room. The blankets, the fire, the food she'd prepared with love. Everything she had worked so hard to offer him was being left behind. Max, still weak but alert, lay in the back seat, his body curled up as if seeking comfort from the motion. His large brown eyes flickered toward Olivia from time to time, and even though he couldn't speak, she could hear him. She could feel his plea for safety, for the reassurance of the warmth she had provided him. But she knew she couldn't keep him here, not in this state. His survival depended on more than just love and warmth. It depended on expertise, on the tools that only the clinic could offer. Max was everything to Olivia now. In a world full of the unknown, of complicated medical decisions and constant battles to save lives, Max was the one certainty. He had entered her life at a time when everything had felt chaotic, when the pressures of her medical career and personal struggles weighed too heavily. Max had been there with nothing but loyalty, asking for nothing in return. And now, in his time of need, she had to make the difficult choice to let go of her instincts as a caretaker at home and trust others to do what they could. As they neared the clinic, the familiar, cold, whitewashed walls of the building loomed ahead, and Olivia's chest tightened. She hadn't worked here in months, not since she had taken her sabbatical, but the memories of the sterile rooms, the beeping machines, and the antiseptic smell flooded back to her. She had spent years inside these walls, performing surgeries, making diagnoses, and helping countless animals. But now, as a patient's loved one, it felt different. It felt like she was walking into a world that wasn't hers anymore. "Hang in there, Max," she whispered to the dog as she parked the car. "I won't leave you." With a sigh, she got out of the car and opened the back door, lifting Max as carefully as she could. He was still so fragile, his body limp but with a lightness that suggested he trusted her completely. She cradled him in her arms, feeling the warmth of his body against her chest as she walked into the clinic. The sterile brightness of the room hit her like a wave, and she braced herself, focusing on Max instead of the overwhelming reality of where they were. Inside, Dr. Harris was already waiting, standing by one of the examination tables with a clipboard in hand. He looked at Olivia, his face serious but kind, and offered her a reassuring smile. "We'll take good care of him, Olivia," he said softly. Max gave a soft whimper, and Olivia felt her heart crack just a little. He was scared. He didn't want to be here. She didn't want to be here, either. But this was where Max had the best chance. The hospital was where he could receive the treatment he needed, where doctors could monitor his condition more closely. She placed Max gently onto the examination table, smoothing out the blankets beneath him, her hands trembling as she did so. "Please, just be okay," she murmured under her breath. Dr. Harris began to examine Max, his hands moving carefully over the dog's body. Olivia stood to the side, her arms crossed tightly over her chest as she tried not to be overwhelmed by the worry that was gnawing at her. Dr. Harris's movements were methodical, professional, but Olivia saw the way his brow furrowed, the way his mouth tightened into a grim line. "How bad is it?" Olivia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Harris glanced up, his eyes meeting hers. "It's not great, Olivia. The infection is still active. It's affecting his liver and kidneys, and we're going to need to run more tests. We'll start him on 4 antibiotics and fluids, but there's no guarantee yet. We can't know for sure until we see how his body responds." Olivia nodded, trying to steady her breath. The tears she had been holding back for days threatened to fall, but she forced herself to keep them at bay. She had been a doctor too long to let emotions cloud her judgment. But in this moment, as she watched Dr. Harris tend to Max, she couldn't help but feel the weight of her helplessness. Max's body was still so frail, and every labored breath he took seemed to echo in her ears. She couldn't bear to lose him. Not now. Not after everything they had been through together. "I'll stay with him," Olivia said firmly, her eyes locking with Dr. Harris's. "I won't leave him." Dr. Harris gave a brief nod, his expression softening just slightly. "Of course. I'll check in on you both later." As Dr. Harris walked away to give instructions to the nurse, Olivia stayed by Max's side, her fingers brushing through his fur as she whispered to him, telling him he was strong, that he was going to get through this, that he couldn't give up. Hours passed in silence, save for the soft beeping of monitors and the faint sound of Max's breathing. Olivia had never been so still in her life. She felt like time was suspended, like the universe had stopped to watch her, to judge her decisions. She had made so many difficult calls in her career, but this was different. This was personal. When Dr. Harris returned, his face had a new, more urgent look to it. "Olivia, I need to talk to you." The words hung in the air, heavy and thick. Olivia's heart raced as she followed him into the small office off to the side, away from the bright, sterile examination room. He sat down behind the desk and looked at her with a look she recognized all too well, one of gravity, of understanding. "The tests came back. Max's condition has deteriorated faster than we expected. We're looking at organ failure, possibly irreversible. His body's not responding to the antibiotics the way we'd hoped." Olivia felt the floor slip out from under her. Her breath caught in her throat, and she had to brace herself against the desk, fighting to keep herself steady. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "No, that can't be right. He can't." She couldn't finish the sentence. She wouldn't. Dr. Harris's eyes were soft, but there was nothing he could say to make this any easier. "Olivia, I'm sorry. We're doing everything we can, but his chances of survival are slim. We may need to consider letting him go." The words hit her like a physical blow. It was as though everything she had been holding together had shattered in an instant. Max was slipping away, and there was nothing more she could do. Olivia sat motionless in the quiet corner of the room, the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead filling the air. The soft beeping of Max's heart monitor was the only sound in the otherwise still space, and each beep felt like a small echo of her own heartbeat, fragile and unsure. She hadn't left his side since Dr. Harris had delivered the news. He had asked her to take a moment, to think, but there was no thinking. There was only a deep, gnawing pain that consumed every thought she had. Max was fighting, but she wasn't sure how much longer he could hold on. Her hands trembled as she reached out to gently stroke his fur. His breathing was slow, labored. His body, once so full of energy, now seemed fragile and delicate, as if each breath he took was a small victory against the inevitable. "Come on, Max," she whispered, leaning down to rest her forehead against his. "You've been through so much. You've come this far. Don't give up on me now." But even as she said the words, doubt crept in. Max had already fought so hard. Could he continue? Was there anything left in him? Her mind flashed to the times when Max had first come into her life, the excitement of finding him, the bond they had forged in those first moments of connection. He had been scared, but so full of love. She had seen in him something she hadn't realized she'd needed. Hope, companionship, something real in a world that felt distant and clinical. But now, sitting here with him, watching as his body fought a battle he couldn't win. Olivia was filled with the helplessness she had always fought to avoid. She had saved lives before. She had done everything she could to give people and animals hope. But here, in this moment, it wasn't enough. Her heart broke as she realized she might have to make the hardest decision of her life. She couldn't bear the thought of losing Max, but she knew that holding on when there was no hope left could be more painful than letting go. Dr. Harris appeared at the door, his face gentle but serious. He didn't need to say anything. The look in his eyes spoke volumes. Olivia knew that the time had come to make a decision, one that would define not just Max's fate, but the way she would remember their time together. Olivia stood motionless at the edge of Max's bed, the quiet whirring of the machines and the soft rhythm of his breathing filling the sterile room. Her heart ached in her chest, each beat louder than the last, as she watched him, so small, so fragile, yet still fighting. The silence was almost unbearable. In the corner, the clock on the wall ticked away the seconds, a reminder that time was slipping by. But time had never felt so irrelevant. Nothing mattered more than the life of the dog lying before her, the dog who had somehow become her whole world in the span of just a few short months. Her eyes burned with unshed tears as she gently stroked Max's ear, his body warm beneath her hand. The bond between them, unspoken but undeniable, swelled in her chest. He had been with her through some of the hardest moments of her life, offering nothing but unconditional love, loyalty, and companionship. He had pulled her from the darkness of her own mind, made her believe in the good again, in the possibility of hope. Max had saved her, just as much as she had saved him. But now, it was her turn to save him. She couldn't let him go. Not like this. Not when there was still a chance. The weight of that responsibility bore down on her, making it hard to breathe, hard to think clearly. Her instincts as a doctor were warring with the emotions she felt as his caregiver, his friend. She knew what needed to be done. She knew what the test said, what Dr. Harris had warned her about. But that didn't make the decision any easier. The choice was clear, but it wasn't simple. Letting him go would end his suffering, release him from the pain that racked his body. But could she really make that choice? Could she sign the papers that would end his life, knowing that she would never feel his warmth beside her again, never hear his soft whimpers of joy, never watch his eyes light up when she walked through the door? The door to the room creaked open, and Dr. Harris stepped inside, his expression grave but kind. He didn't speak right away, giving Olivia a moment to collect herself, but she knew what he was here to say. She had known for a while, even before he had walked in, that this was coming. "Olivia," he began gently, his voice a quiet murmur. "We've done everything we can, but Max's body isn't responding. His organs are shutting down, and I don't think there's much more we can do. He's in pain." His words, though soft, cut through Olivia like a knife. She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to hold it together, but the tears came anyway. She couldn't hold them back any longer. "I don't want him to suffer," she whispered, her voice shaking. "But I don't want to say goodbye either." Dr. Harris moved closer, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "I know. This is never easy. But sometimes the kindest thing we can do is let them go, when the suffering is too much." Olivia nodded, her breath ragged as she wiped away the tears. Her mind swirled with doubts, with regrets, with the overwhelming weight of the decision. Max had been there for her, had always been there, but could she really be strong enough to let him go? As if sensing her turmoil, Max lifted his head weakly, his eyes locking onto hers. The faintest wag of his tail was the only sign that he still had energy left, that he still wanted to fight. But his body was failing him, and Olivia knew that. She could see it in the way his eyes seemed to flicker, the way his breaths became more shallow. He was tired, and the fight had left him. Olivia leaned down, her forehead pressing gently against Max's, whispering the words she had never wanted to say. "I love you, Max. I will never forget you." For a long moment, the room was silent, save for the steady beep of the heart monitor, marking each precious second they had left. Olivia could feel the weight of the decision pressing on her, could feel the anguish of knowing that no matter what she chose, the pain would linger. But she knew, deep down, that it was time. Time to let Max go. to set him free from the suffering that no love or care could change. "Dr. Harris," Olivia said, her voice breaking, "I'm ready." The moment of truth shows Olivia coming to terms with the inevitable loss of Max. The emotional journey culminates in her decision to let go, to end his suffering and give him peace. The connection between Olivia and Max is laid bare as she finds the strength to make one of the hardest decisions she will ever have to make. The minutes stretched into hours, each one seemingly longer than the last. Olivia sat beside Max, the weight of her decision pressing down on her chest like a vice. His body was still, but the faint rise and fall of his ribs reminded her that he was still here, still fighting. But the fight was fading, slowly, inevitably. Her hand trembled as she ran her fingers through his fur, the familiar softness of it comforting yet painful all at once. It was a cruel irony. How the touch that had once brought so much comfort now felt like a goodbye. She had never imagined this moment, never allowed herself to think about it. Max had always been the strong one, the one who brought light to her darkest days. But now, she had to be the strong one for him. The decision seemed so clear, and yet, it felt like the hardest thing she had ever done. Olivia had spent her entire career as a doctor, making life-and-death decisions every day. She had been the one to provide comfort to families, to give them the clarity to make the hardest choices. But this was different. Max wasn't just a patient. He was her companion, her friend, the one who had always been there, standing beside her through the good and the bad. How could she let go of that? How could she say goodbye to him when every part of her screamed to keep him with her? Her thoughts were interrupted by the soft sound of Max's breath, shallow and labored. Her heart clenched as she watched him, his once bright eyes now dull, flickering as if he was struggling to hold on. She could see the pain in his face, in the way his body trembled slightly, as if every breath was a battle. And she knew, deep down, that this was not a battle he could win. His body was exhausted, his spirit worn thin. "Please, Max," she whispered through clenched teeth, her voice thick with emotion. "Please don't go. Please stay with me." But the words felt empty, a hollow plea to the universe that she knew wouldn't change anything. Max had been strong for so long, but now, he needed her to be strong for him. It wasn't about keeping him alive for her sake. It was about doing what was best for him. And deep inside, Olivia knew that if she truly loved him, she couldn't let him suffer any longer. A soft knock on the door startled her, and she turned to see Dr. Harris standing in the doorway. His expression was kind but solemn, the lines around his eyes deep with the knowledge that this moment was inevitable. He had been with her through this entire process, offering his expertise, his support, but now, the decision was hers alone. "I'm so sorry," he said gently, his voice carrying the weight of his own emotions. "I know how much Max means to you." Olivia didn't say anything. She couldn't find the words. Instead, she just nodded, her throat constricting as tears threatened to spill over once again. She couldn't look at Dr. Harris, couldn't meet his eyes, because she knew what he was asking of her. She had already known, deep down, that this moment would come. Dr. Harris stepped forward, his presence calm and steady. "Olivia," he continued softly, "Max is not the same dog he was. I can see it. You can see it. And sometimes, the most loving thing we can do is let them go, when their pain outweighs their chance for recovery. But it's your decision, and I'll support you no matter what." Olivia felt a lump form in her throat, the weight of the decision threatening to crush her. The pain in her chest was so overwhelming that she couldn't breathe. She wanted to say something, wanted to argue, to beg for another chance. But deep inside, she knew there were no more chances left. Max had fought as hard as he could. She had to be the one to let him rest. As if sensing her turmoil, Max lifted his head slightly, his eyes meeting hers for a brief moment. It was the faintest of glances, but it was enough. His eyes, those familiar, trusting eyes, looked into hers with the same love and devotion they always had. And in that fleeting moment, Olivia understood. He was ready. He was tired. And it was time to let him go. A sob broke free from her chest, and she pressed her face into Max's fur, clinging to him as if holding on could somehow change everything. "I love you," she whispered, her voice trembling with grief. "I will always love you." The tears came freely now, spilling over in an endless stream as she cradled Max's head in her hands. The weight of the decision of saying goodbye was unbearable, but she knew it was the right one. She couldn't selfishly keep him here, in pain, for her own comfort. She had to let him go, to set him free. "I'm sorry," she whispered, the words coming out ragged. "I'm so sorry." Dr. Harris, standing quietly by her side, offered her a gentle, understanding look. He had seen this moment play out so many times in his career, but it never got any easier. He knew how hard it was to make that final choice, to watch someone's heart break as they let go of a loved one. "You're doing the right thing, Olivia," he said softly. "You're giving him peace." And with that, Olivia made the hardest decision of her life. She stood up slowly, her knees weak, her heart shattered, and nodded at Dr. Harris. "Please, just make it quick." Olivia sat in the stillness of her office, her hands resting on the desk in front of her. The room was quiet, the only sound being the faint hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. She had been back at work for several days now, trying to put on a brave face, trying to keep the world moving forward. But each day felt like she was walking through a fog, a heavy mist that clouded her thoughts and left her feeling numb. Max's collar, now carefully placed beside her computer, remained a silent reminder of the love they had shared. She could almost hear the jingling of the tag, a sound that had once brought so much comfort, but now it only brought grief. She could still remember the way his tail would wag whenever she walked through the door, the way his eyes would light up when she called his name. It felt as if a part of her had been ripped away, a piece that could never be replaced. The decision she had made, the one she had fought so hard to avoid, had been the right one. She knew it. Max had been suffering, and in the end, he had found peace. But even knowing that, even understanding it logically, did nothing to ease the ache in her chest. Her phone buzzed on the desk, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a message from a patient she had been treating for months, a woman whose dog had been battling a severe illness. Olivia quickly scanned the message. "Dr. Olivia, I wanted to thank you for everything you did for my dog. I can't tell you how much we appreciate your care. We will forever be grateful for you." The words brought a lump to her throat, a mix of gratitude and sadness flooding over her. She had done this so many times. She had saved countless animals, helped so many families through their hardest moments. But this, losing Max, this was different. There was no amount of gratitude or appreciation that could make the pain of his loss feel any less. Olivia leaned back in her chair, closing her eyes for a moment. She thought about Max, about the bond they had shared. She had always known that being a doctor meant facing the possibility of loss. It was part of the job. But she had never imagined that the loss would be so personal. It was as if her whole world had shifted, and she was struggling to find her footing again. The sound of footsteps in the hallway broke her reverie, and she looked up to see her colleague, Dr. Harris, standing in the doorway. His eyes were soft, filled with understanding, and Olivia knew that he could sense the heaviness she was carrying. "Olivia," he said gently, stepping into the room. "How are you holding up?" She didn't answer right away. How could she? The truth was, she didn't know how to hold up. She had lost her best friend, her companion. It felt like she was walking around with a hole in her heart that could never be filled. "I'm managing," she replied finally, her voice sounding much weaker than she intended. "Just taking it one day at a time." Dr. Harris nodded, his face reflecting the sympathy he had been holding back. "I know how hard this is for you. Max was special, and I know how much he meant to you." Olivia could feel the tears threatening to spill over again, and she quickly wiped her eyes, trying to regain her composure. "I don't know how to move forward," she admitted quietly. "It feels like I'm stuck in this place where everything is still, and nothing will ever feel the same again." Dr. Harris placed a hand on her shoulder, a gesture of support, of quiet understanding. "It's okay to feel lost. It's okay to grieve. But you have to remember that Max would want you to keep going, to keep doing the work that you love. He would want you to continue helping other animals, just like you did for him." His words cut through her sorrow like a lifeline, and Olivia found herself nodding, a flicker of something other than grief beginning to stir inside her. Max had been a part of her life, yes, but he had also been a symbol of the love and care she had for all creatures, big and small. And if she truly loved him, if she truly honored his memory, she couldn't let the pain of his loss consume her. She had to keep going. For him. For all the others who needed her. The days began to blur together as Olivia threw herself into her work. There was no avoiding it. She had chosen a profession where healing and loss were both inevitable. But the shift in her focus felt different now. It wasn't about saving every life. It was about making the most of the time they had. Max had shown her that. He had shown her what it meant to love unconditionally, to live fully, even when time was short. He had been more than just a pet. He had been her companion, her partner, and in many ways, her teacher. Through his presence, she had learned what it meant to be truly present in the moment, to cherish the little things. With that realization, Olivia found herself walking into her clinic each day with the renewed sense of purpose. Her heart was still heavy, the grief never far from the surface, but she had begun to understand that she could carry that grief with love. She didn't have to move on completely, didn't have to pretend that everything was okay, but she could honor Max's memory by continuing the work they had both loved. One morning, as she sat at her desk, the door to her office opened, and a familiar face appeared. Another colleague, a nurse this time, holding a small puppy in her arms. The puppy was shaking, its little body too frail for such a big world. The moment Olivia laid eyes on it, she felt a wave of recognition. This was what she did. This was what Max had taught her to do. She looked at the puppy, then at the nurse, and her heart swelled with a deep, profound feeling. "Dr. Olivia, this little one is in desperate need of some love," the nurse said, her voice soft, almost apologetic. "Can you help?" Olivia stood, her hands immediately going to the puppy. It felt like a sign, a way for her to heal. Maybe this wasn't the same as Max, but in this moment, she knew that her love, her care, was still capable of making a difference. She didn't have to do it alone. She had a team, and she had the love of animals to guide her. As she cradled the tiny puppy in her arms, a sense of peace washed over her. The pain was still there, lingering in the background, but now it felt like something she could carry. She didn't need to rush past the grief. She could hold on to it, honor it, and keep moving forward, step by step. The puppy squirmed in her arms, licking her fingers with its tiny tongue, and Olivia smiled. She could already see how it was going to change, how it would heal, just like all the others before it. And in that moment, she knew that Max's legacy was not just in the love he had given her. It was in the care she would continue to provide to every animal who needed her. As the days passed, Olivia found herself telling stories about Max, sharing his memory with anyone who would listen. She told her patients, her colleagues, even strangers who came into the clinic, about the dog who had taught her the true meaning of love and loyalty. And in those stories, Max lived on. In every life she touched, his spirit was there, reminding her of the importance of each and every moment. Max may have been gone, but the impact he had on her life would last forever. Max's story is one of loss, love, and healing, a reminder of the deep, unspoken bonds we share with those we love, whether they walk on two legs or four. Olivia's journey from heartache to hope reflects the universal truth that love never truly fades. Even in the toughest of times, we can find strength in the memories we hold dear and in the work we do to make the world a better place. If Max's story touched you, we encourage you to share this video, to spread his legacy of compassion, and to support the animals in your community. Every life, every animal, deserves a chance to be loved and cared for. No act is too small, and no effort is ever wasted. If you've been moved by Olivia's journey, by Max's impact, take a moment to comment below and share your own experiences. Have you ever experienced the unconditional love of a pet, or the incredible bond between human and animal? We'd love to hear your story. Together, we can make a difference, one heart at a time. Let's keep the love alive and honor the ones who teach us the most about what it means to truly care.